and we will discuss one by one the steps of the research process. Okay, so our learning objectives for this presentation is by the end of the session, the learner should be able to describe the characteristics of the research process, give examples of problems which can be investigated through health research or the nursing research, explain the different steps in research process and differentiate between internal and external validity of research results. Um, okay, so let's now proceed with the steps in conducting research. You know, research is a rigorous process which involves steps or sequential steps from problem identification to the utilization of results. So the first is to identify and define the research problem. We have to review the literature and related to the problem, develop the conceptual framework underlying the research problem, revisit the research objectives, define the variables to be studied, construct the research design, design the tools for data collection, design the data analysis plan, plan for the administrative aspects of research, collect the data, process the collected data, and analyze the data, research report, disseminate the report, and utilize the research results. Now, I will provide first the overview of the 15 steps in conducting research. So the first step is to identify and define the research problem. So since research is a problem-solving activity, it only follows that the first step is to identify and define the research problem. So it has four sub-steps: selecting a research topic, identifying the research problem, formulating the research objectives, and determining the significance of the research problem and objectives identified. So at the first step in the definition of the research problem, andito na lahat yun ha, yung research problem or the topic and then the objectives and the significance of the study. Then, uh, it is therefore important to properly identify and formulate um, your research problem. I'm happy that you are all the three groups were able to provide the output on the research topic and the research problem. However, uh, there are corrections. I will set for an appointment for each group, probably next week, on how to do it with your research problem and the research topic or objectives. So the second step is the review of related literature. It involves answering the question, what is already known about the topic and the research objective you wish to investigate. It provides a concise description and critical evaluation of work which has already been done on the research area of interest. And then the third step is the development of the conceptual framework underlying the research problem. The conceptual framework is a written or a visual presentation which explains graphically in narrative form or both the main variables being studied in the proposed research. It serves as the bridge between the review of related literature and the formulation of the final form of the research objectives. It is a representation of the structure and content of the study based on the theoretical knowledge and empirical evidence derived from the review of related literature. Okay, so therefore, the conceptual framework will para siya mag-guide. It will provide pathway, the association or the connection or um, the pathway by the independent variables to the dependent variables. Then number four, revisit the research objectives. So in the first step, you have formulated the research objectives, but in the fourth, you have to revisit the research objectives. So after the researcher has reviewed the literature related to his research objectives, and has even developed the underlying conceptual framework, it is expected that he has now to a better understanding exactly what he wants to do in his research. So therefore, um, he is in a better position to revisit the research objectives which he formulated at the start of the research process and redefine the actual problem for investigation in more clear and specific terms. So this involves the process of reviewing, refining, or fine-tuning the first draft of the general and specific objectives based on the new knowledge derived from the review of related literature. Okay? So let's proceed with the fifth step is to define the variables to be studied. So this is part of the definition of terms. Okay. So after the research objectives has been revised in your fourth step, and hopefully that will be your ano na, your final composition of the objectives. Now you will now define the variables. Okay, so the act of defining variables can cover four different substeps, such as number one, you have to formulate operational definitions of variables. So when we say operational definition of variables, those are the terms or the variables that you define based on what you use, okay, for the applicability in your study. Identify attributes of the variables to be studied in the research project. This is dictated by the research objectives and can involve any of the following, like number one, estimating magnitude of parameters or determine the differences or you investigate the relationship between variables. Mm. And then you have to identify the dependent, independent, and control variables. So in your study, pwede hindi lang dalawa yung variables, hindi lang independent, hindi lang independent, but you have another variable, like control variable, or an intervening variable, or a moderating variable if there is, or if there are. Then you have to formulate testable hypothesis if asked for by the research objectives. Okay. Um, but you have to take note that not all researches would require a dependent or independent or a control variables. And even in not all researches require hypothesis. And the sixth step is to construct the research design. Okay. Research design construction is technically the most challenging part of the research process um, because it covers several areas and tries to answer several important questions regarding how the research will be conducted. Like for example, the use of study design. what kind of a study will be the most appropriate design in order to answer the research objectives. So would it be a descriptive, experimental, or quasi-experimental, or qualitative version? Uh, so there are many types of research design. Okay? Then the methods of subject selection. How will the research participants be selected? Okay, so you are dealing here with the sampling technique or the sampling design. Then the sample size, how many subjects will be selected? Okay, so you are determining how many participants, okay, or respondents will be part of the study. Okay, would that number of participants or respondents is would give a ano ba reliable or impact results, okay, to the general population. Yon. The number four, strategies for control and manipulation of relevant variables. So what can be done to minimize biases in the study based on the design, the sampling technique, and the sample size, and even as you as a researcher. Yeah. So next we have establishment of criteria to evaluate outcomes. How can I define my dependent variables so that they can be objectively measured? So meaning to say, there is or at least walang bias yung pag-evaluate ng outcomes. And another one is the instrumentation or the tools used. Okay, what measurement instruments or data collection tools will I use to ensure the validity of the data collected? So, depending on your research objectives, there are many possible research designs which you can formulate. Actually, it has its own strengths and weaknesses. So, you have to maximize both its internal and external validity. Okay, so the internal validity of your research design answers the question: does the study measure what it intends to measure? So it means that it refers to which various types of biases are controlled in the study, like comparability of subjects or measurement bias and many others. And external validity, on the other hand, it means the extent to which the study results can be generalized to a larger population represented with a sample. So it covers issues related to the representativeness of the samples and the adequacy of the sample size. Meaning to say, um, is it applicable to the general population? Does your results will represent the entire population? No. So, yun yung tinutukoy ng external validity. Kapag internal validity naman, you are dealing with controlling the biases that may occur in your study. Okay? Then, number seven, you have to design the tools for data collection. So there are many types of data collection tools, such as in forms, interview schedules, questionnaires, checklists, and guides. Okay, these are for ngayon na may pandemic, actually the Google form for online survey is most applicable. Okay? So how they are designed depends on a number of factors, most important of which are the objectives of the study and the plans for data analysis for the variables to be included. So it must um, guide or answer the objectives of the study and will not give you confusion in your analysis of the variables. Then number eight, you have to design the data analysis plan. So designing the plan, For data analysis involves two aspects: construction of a dummy table corresponding to each research objective. Most research funding agencies require the presentation of dummy tables as part of the um, research proposal. So, number two is identification of statistical techniques to be applied in order to answer the research objectives. Essentially, if you are on quantitative research, either you can have the descriptive research or your inferential research. Then number nine, plan for the administrative aspects of research. So, um, when we say the administrative aspect of research, you are dealing with the ethical approval, okay, or ethical clearance. And because not all phases of the research process are technical. So you have to protect the participants who are potentially exposed to certain risks through the participation in the research. And so a researcher is therefore um, important to obtain research ethical approval from an accredited ethical review board prior to the start of the research. Actually, there are tawag ito, mga funding agency of the research, they actually require ethical clearance. Okay. You do not provide financial support if there is no ethical approval. Likewise, the different publishers, the journal, the hardly published research articles na walang ethics clearance. Okay? So, in our school, UP Manila has its own review ethics board, the UPMREB. And here in Region 8, we also have our own review ethics board, committee of the Eastern Visayas Regional Health and Development Council. Okay? Another one, aside from the ethical review board, it is important to have a timetable of your research activities. Okay, you have to develop a research timetable, which is usually presented in the form of a Gantt chart. So it is therefore important for the researcher to develop a reasonable budget and time to cover the costs in implementing all the research activities. And then number 10, collect the data. Okay. This is the research process that generally involves most of your time, effort, and cost. So usually kung large sample or mahaba yung research instrument or yung design is pangmatagalan, you really have to allot more time, including the budget. Eh, It can also be the most frustrating and problematic step if the researcher did not allocate enough time and efforts in planning for the data collection phase of the research, much of which are covered in the first 9 steps in the research process. Then number 11, you have to process the collected data. Okay? Data processing is a very important phase in the research process because it is the first step in transforming raw data, which was collected during the collection phase, into information. Data processing has two very important components. We have the data editing and the data coding. Then analyze the data. Okay? The data analysis is one of the technical phases of the research process. because it involves the application of statistical tools. Okay. The greatest challenge in data analysis is determining the most appropriate statistical tools to apply given the objectives of the research and the type of data collected. Okay. So if you are on, say for example, qualitative research study, you will not use a statistical data that has an inferential or descriptive in nature. Okay? We have other form of um, analysis technique for qualitative data. So you have to consider all of this. Then if you have now the results, the analysis, and the interpretation, you have now to write the research report and the discussions. Okay. So the second most important document that the researcher will write is to write the report. Okay. So you have to write the report well. It reflects how the research was actually conducted and what the results are. No matter how well the research was implemented, its value cannot be fully appreciated or even utilized if it is not properly documented in the research report. And once you have written your final output, of course you have to disseminate the report. Mm, okay? No matter how good the research results are, it cannot be utilized if they are not properly disseminated, since potential users will not be aware of it. Mm. So, therefore, research dissemination is a prerequisite for research utilization. There are many forms of research dissemination. Okay? The traditional modes are publishing research results in technical journals and other forms of scientific publications, as well as presenting them in conferences, meetings, and seminars. Of course, uh, we have to be very careful in choosing the journals for publication. We have to select reputable journals, okay, and publishers, not those na mga what we call that yung hindi masyado siyang reputable. We call that as predatory journals or predatory publisher. Then we have the less technical forms of research dissemination include we have the press release and radio and TV presentations. Okay, like for example, if your study or research results or findings, ano siya, parang sponsor siya ng isang law na gagawin or represent sa Kamara or sa Senate, okay? Then your research result can be disseminated through that means. And the last phase is to utilize the research results. So research dissemination and research utilization are complementary activities. Okay? The extent and nature of research utilization are highly dependent on the extent and nature of its dissemination. So an important aspect of research utilization is the proper identification of potential users who are expected to make use of or benefit from the research results. This can be um, policymakers, okay, program managers, service providers, or academicians, and the general population. What is important is for the researcher to identify the information needs of each of these potential users and to what extent, okay, their interest by maintaining constant interaction with them, even while the research is still ongoing, and if possible, even get them involved in the research process. Okay, so that ends with my first presentation. Um, Thank you. Meron bang question?